Welcome to Improving Compensatory Mitigation. Carlene sent me the title of this a while ago, and I was like, is that really the title of our How to Improve Compensatory Mitigation? It's like the whole conference is going to be at this thing, right? So the coolest title of the whole session, in my opinion. So, all right, enough of that. Brief intro from me, and then we'll get this show on the road. Real quick, my name's Troy Anderson. I'm with Ecosystem Investment Partners. I've been with the firm since 2014. I do have 25 years of restoration experience, which seems strange to say that out loud. I've currently worked in permitted mitigation banks and water quality projects in 5 different districts. So, like a lot of you here, I've experienced a lot of different assessment methodologies, from RBPs to ratio to SWIVM to UMAM to ORAM, and then what Nick's going to talk about later here, the Maryland Stream Mitigation Framework, and what the kids around the campfire are calling to Nick is just the framework, just so you know. That's the cool term these days. So on one hand, this is super cool because, we get to know all these different ways to assess stream and wetlands and understand the mechanics of how the value is assessed. On the other hand, it's super frustrating to get to know all these different ways of assessing streams and wetlands and to understand the mechanics of how they're assessed, right? For those of you who work in different districts, you kind of know what I'm talking about. Once you get familiar with one, you got to learn the other one. They're similar, but not the same. But the goal, of course, is to get run it through the grinder to a good uplift of a restoration of some kind, whatever it's going to be, stream, wetland, even uplands in some case, and that's what we're trying to do here. So I'm super excited with this panel because we're going to hear kind of everything from sort of the inception of what is assessment methodology, what are we trying to do here from long ago, all the way up to what Nick's going to talk about of a brand new assessment methodology that's he's rolling out currently, and I think is actually in practice. I've actually used it. I'm from Baltimore, so it's live, not official I think yet, but it's coming. Housekeeping here, I'm going to introduce everybody here sort of in reverse order of how they're going to talk, and if we could just hold all questions unless there's sort of a clarification question on something until the very end of the session, that'd be great. So I'll start with Nick Osbor. Nick has worked at the Baltimore district for 10 years. In that time, he has worked on mitigation banks, infrastructure projects, restoration reviews, and mitigation process development. He now serves primarily as a mitigation SME for the district. Nick has degrees in environmental science and fisheries and spent his early career delivering mitigation projects at an in-lieu fee program in Kentucky. Brian Topping has worked at the US EPA since 2004 in the Clean Water Act Section 404 regulatory program. He worked on stream flow duration assessment method development, programmatic tracking and reporting, training, and compensatory mitigation with a focus on stream mitigation. Bill Ainsley, quick aside, Bill and I didn't know this until about a month and a half ago, that he and I went to the same high school in Madison, Wisconsin, which is sort of both Wisconsin. We'll see how he says the name Wisconsin and see if we can match here. So go Lancers. We didn't graduate in the same class. Yeah. Bill received his bachelor's degree from a small liberal arts school in the upper Midwest, which shall remain nameless because the word liberal has become impolitic and most don't know the school anyway. After undergrad, Bill received a master's degree in a discipline which seemed pertinent at the time, but the details of which he can't quite remember because he received it when stone tablets were still the preferred medium for written communication. While at EPA, Bill has worked in the wetland regulatory program for 35 years, during which time his major claim to fame in wetland functional assessment is that he is the only current federal employee who remembers the dingy hotel conference room, as well as most of the attendees of the first HGM AT meeting in Slidell, Louisiana in '91. Despite that experience, Bill still continues to support the approach. While working on various HGM guidebooks, Bill has conducted studies on the effects of caffeine consumption on early morning assessment results, as well as the repellent effect on cigar smoke on wetland mosquitoes, and it's been a long time since entomology, so I'm not going to say the name here, all right? Okay. When not at work, Bill can typically be found either sipping brewed beverages, which provide a stimulating effect, or those brewed beverages that don't. He is a lifelong Green Bay Packer fan and a brat enthusiast, and remains consistently amazed and grateful that his wife still likes him, his kids still talk to him, his employer still pays him, and his colleagues still put up with him. Welcome, Bill. Take it away.
Takes a village. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. Okay. I'd like to thank Troy and the conference for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Several years ago, I was approached by our section chief about developing a mitigation checklist for staff to use to review mitigation proposals. I wrestled with how to develop a checklist that would apply to all aquatic resource types in the Southeast, as well as be useful between our core districts in implementing the compensatory mitigation program. This checklist became a 5-year effort, which has evolved over that time and benefited from technical inputs and review by outside experts, both from the private sector and academia, countless edits, revisions, and rewrites, and reformatting. So in this brief overview today, we'll go through the why, what, where, how, and who behind this document. What's advance? Oh, that one. Cool. Ultimately, the document was written to promote viable, sustainable, and resilient aquatic resource restoration in the Section 404 program in the Southeast. In our experience, we have seen some amazing work done to restore wetlands and streams. On the other hand, we have seen some rather cringeworthy projects. In some cases, core SOPs and reviews were improved as lessons were learned, and in other cases, the current procedures did not change to address past shortfalls and current challenges. We have also seen different providers use different techniques to accomplish the goal of restoring aquatic resources with good results. In some areas of the Southeast, these techniques were allowed as appropriate compensatory mitigation, and in others, they were resisted. As members of IRTs, EPA is often looked upon to provide technical comments on compensatory mitigation projects. Therefore, we thought it important to construct an approach that would provide consistency within Region 4 via asking the same questions of all providers and promote better projects given the inherent variability within the program and the science of ecological restoration. It was also go back. Oh. It was also important to try to address wetlands and streams with the same approach and within the context of compensatory mitigation. So the document covers a wide range of topics that we feel are pertinent to ecological restoration and compensatory mitigation of both aquatic resource types, and provide enough detail about those topics to allow the reviewer to understand why it is important, what information they should ask for, and how to determine if the information provided is appropriate. This is why the document is so long. However, it is important to note this is not an assessment, a method, a model, or an algorithm, and it does not deal with crediting. This approach will not lead to a final determinative answer, like an index or a quantitative output, but rather focuses on the critical aspects of restoration that need to be considered during review. Where does it apply? It applies to wetlands and streams and uses southeastern wetland and stream examples. However, the concepts and information involved in this approach are likely applicable across a broader geographic range. For instance, HGM, both classification and assessment, can be applied in many different regions of the country, and the stream classification factors from the approach and the stream functions pyramid apply to many stream types. This approach represents a distillation of the 12 elements found in the planning and documentation, ecological performance standards, and monitoring and management sections of the mitigation rule into 6 basic questions to facilitate regulatory review of wetland and stream mitigation proposals. Those questions are: what is the current class of the proposed mitigation site? What is the baseline condition of the site? And/or what stressors are acting on the site? What is the target condition that is proposed for the site? Or in other words, what is the provider's vision or goal for the site? How does the provider intend to get the site to the target condition? How will the provider document progress toward the target condition? And once the target condition is achieved, how will it be maintained? These 6 questions, which every mitigation reviewer should ask, frame the 12 elements from the rule in a logical and ecologically meaningful way to provide a consistent, ecologically based approach to evaluate any given wetland and/or stream mitigation project proposal for its sustainable ecological potential. The fundamental construct of the approach is illustrated here. Essentially, when a site is proposed, reviewers will want to first understand its current aquatic resource type, which provides information about aquatic resource functions that should be assessed as part of the baseline assessment, and also provide the basis for goal and objective setting. Methods used for assessing baseline conditions should identify site impairments and stressors relative to the appropriate reference conditions, which affect the restoration potential of the proposed site and inform the development of project-specific goals and objectives. A mitigation plan is devised to address project goals and objectives, such as to alleviate impairments and stressors and improve or return the expected functions characteristic of the aquatic resource type given watershed constraints. Within the mitigation plan, a monitoring plan should be provided which identifies the methods and intensity of sampling to establish that the target conditions as measured by performance standards have been met and to verify the site has achieved its ecological objectives, or, in other words, that impairments and stressors have been remedied or alleviated. If performance standards have not been met, then adaptive management is implemented to correct the aspect of the original plan which proved ineffective. Once the site has achieved or is on a trajectory to achieve the target condition, long-term management to maintain the site can begin. Here's a breakdown of each question, the section of the document it is in, and the essential wetland and stream information recommended to address each question. Each section of the approach includes detailed rationale, links to the mitigation rule, and recommended technical information and resources to help frame and provide useful information in answering each question. Classification is a critical first step in the mitigation project review process to focus information gathering, provide a conceptual framework for understanding wetland and stream ecological processes, and fundamentally set the stage for the effective implementation of the proposed mitigation project. For wetlands, we recommend hydrogeomorphically classifying the site, and for streams, using a combination of current stream classifications that provide insight into watershed context, hydrologic flows, and geomorphology. Establishing the baseline condition and identifying stressors acting on the proposed site provides insight into factors requiring amelioration to reestablish functions. Target condition, or the projected functional endpoint, establishes the functional expectations for the site through goal setting and the specific actions or measurable objectives which will be implemented and tracked to assess progress towards achieving goals. Reference condition and/or sites should also be identified at this stage to inform target condition, as well as being used in design and monitoring. Mitigation plans ensure mitigation work plan or designs describe the proposed actions that will alleviate the impact of stressors and improve ecosystem functions at the mitigation site. Performance standards are based on the specific goals and objectives of the mitigation project, which should be related to restoration of the functions of the particular wetland and/or stream. Monitoring plans should include efficient measures of performance that indicate functional lift. Where and how often sampling will be conducted to be representative of the whole site, and provide information about the effects of the mitigation action on the stressors acting on the site. Sustaining the target condition over the long term involves all of the steps and conditions laid out in the mitigation rule, which are often tailored to each state and/or district. An adaptive management plan should outline how monitoring results will be analyzed to identify potential problems and identify implementation measures to rectify these problems. Who is it intended for? It is intended to be used by those who review compensatory mitigation plans and was primarily written for EPA Region 4 staff, but could be used by others who review compensatory mitigation projects. As for the level of experience recommended to get the most out of this approach, we feel that reviewers should know about and have read the mitigation rule and should understand the compensatory mitigation IRT process. It would also facilitate understanding and use of the document if the reviewer has some ecological background, either from on-the-job training or academically. However, this is not rocket science, nor is it an in-depth treatise on the body of stream or wetland ecological restoration literature that could be brought to bear on these projects. It is an articulation of what Region 4 thinks are the important elements to be included in compensatory mitigation plans to give us some comfort that the plan has a reasonable chance to succeed. This is my legacy document. It began as my attempt to download what experience and knowledge I had accumulated over my 35 years in the program. Eric Somerville added a great deal of insight based on his accumulated knowledge and experience, and Ashley Monroe provided her expertise in remote sensing and watershed assessment. Julia McCarthy did an exemplary job of editing and reorganizing the document to make it more consistent, readable, and accessible. It is our hope that this document and/or the concepts and information it contains will prove useful for staff when reviewing compensatory mitigation projects. We all know there's a great deal of compensatory mitigation going on out there. This is our attempt to contribute to its viability and sustainability on the landscape. Thank you.
All right, that's a little bit of a tough act to follow. So I'm Brian Topping, and I'm going to talk about something that is changing. Not just the stream systems I'm talking about, but even the title of this project that we've been working on. So some of you we've interviewed over the last year, Sam, and importantly, I'm talking about a project really being led by Sam Lieberg, a colleague, ORISE fellow and colleague at EPA headquarters, who's interviewed, now we're ticking up to over 60 folks, many folks in this room he's interviewed about this project over the last year. And what it's focused on is the evaluation of what we first called dynamic streams and got a lot of feedback on. And so we've revised and more accurately are calling dynamic alluvial valleys, which may continue to be dynamic and change again as we've gotten a lot more feedback as well. what do we mean? What do we mean when we say dynamic alluvial valleys? We're talking about depositional reaches. We're talking about stage 0 restoration approaches, valley restoration approaches, beaver-related activities, or dealing with beaver that come into a design approach that was not necessarily expecting them, and what to do and how to address that. We're talking about systems that will change over time, or may change over time between the number of channels they have and the amount of wetland area versus stream area, and where that is within the healthy range and within the valley stable range for these systems. What we have seen over the years is that we have designed primarily for single thread transport reaches, and not necessarily intentionally, but our protocols and our practices have narrowed our range of options in terms of restoration designs and outcomes to those single thread transport reaches for streams. And so what we are trying to do now is start laying the groundwork for how would you assess, how would you monitor these dynamic alluvial valleys? How would you set performance standards for? What are the options out there for setting performance standards? So we're starting at the base level of the procedures and practices out there, the standard performance standards that are used don't really accommodate these systems. The monitoring approaches don't really accommodate these systems, so we're attacking that tools level to try and lay a base work and see what's out there, and provide a resource for folks to be able to say, I don't need to research this all on my own and develop it. I have some references to look to and some examples. So that's what we've been doing with our interview project to try and literature reviews, to try and reach out and understand these systems and how we can monitor them and how we can set performance standards. We've been interviewing folks from the Corps, EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, state agencies, as well as academics and a lot of practitioners to get what their experiences are with these systems, what their experiences are with when beaver come onto their sites and how they've managed them, and what we could potentially use, both in terms of, yeah, we've used this on our project site as a performance standard or a monitoring approach, or we've tested this out. We've never actually set a performance standard, but we really think this could work. We're experimenting with this. That's an incomplete list as of a few weeks ago, but it keeps growing. So, find yourself. This is why, where's Waldo? Find your name if we've interviewed you. We're talking about monitoring. We're talking about setting performance metrics for these systems. Inherently, we are also pulled into and have to talk somewhat about design standards. When you have dynamic systems, you're tying into another system, upstream and downstream. So there is concern about what happens off-site that can come through your site. And so this is naturally talking about some of the design standards. It's not a design approach. We're not looking to do that. What we are looking to see is what are the considerations you have to apply if you're going to be prepared to allow beaver to come onto the site during performance or long-term monitoring to make sure that your site doesn't unravel because the channel moved around the dam. To make sure that your site, your valley, is stable, not just where you put the channel. Part of this approach requires kind of a reframing of how we look at performance in general as well. For some of these sites and some of these restoration approaches that have been done a lot under voluntary restoration, where they don't have to set performance standards, they're not monitoring to meet performance standards, it's a nice world, you have to think about how long will it take to evolve? And what will it be at 3, 5, 7, 10 years, which is really meaningful in our program when you're trying to get mitigation credit releases. So you need to think about, well, it may be this or it may be this. And so we have to think about alternative endpoints and identifying that, well, this is what we expect it to become, here's how we monitor it, here's how we set performance standards. If the site doesn't do that, because guess what, we started and it's all been drought and we haven't had enough channel forming flows, and so the wetland veg took over and we really don't have enough flow to meander and move it around the site. What's acceptable? Is it within the acceptable range of what you'd see? And so how would you monitor that? How would you set performance standards for that to show that it's still an acceptable outcome, and it's still a healthy outcome, and not just, it's not exactly what you predicted? Because these dynamic systems will change and may change, and we expect them to change, and that's what we see in healthy depositional reaches. And so we want to think about that framework of not necessarily always having one set of performance standards, but also if it does this, what's the change in performance standards, what's the change in how you need to monitor it, and also still being able to identify if it does something else, if it is a single thread channel, that may be okay, but if it's a single thread channel and we meant it to be a dynamic alluvial valley, and the riparian area is all uplands, we're not getting any of the wetting, okay, now we're outside the range of what we wanted to see. And now we do have a problem with our site. It is not going to develop the way, in any way, what we wanted and intended for it. So we catalog a lot of monitoring procedures, and with those monitoring procedures, we touched into different technologies, because it's different when you have multiple channels across the site. Doing transects may not capture what you actually want to see. You may want to have a better, less resolution, but a full site understanding instead of transects to represent something. And so we've looked at different monitoring procedures and introduced some of those. Vegetation may not be homogeneous, and that's all right, but you may be more importantly looking at across the whole site, what's the proportion? Is one vegetation type, is one community dominating or not? We introduce concepts with site scale assessments using GIS, using LiDAR and drone-based photography for certain metrics, vegetation metrics, hydraulics and geomorphology. We looked at and introduced some grid-based sampling approaches for certain metrics that may be more appropriate in these valley-wide systems. And we also looking at the opportunities for things like eDNA. There's a lot of development needed, there's a lot of standardization, you need to have your reference library for the DNA, but it's an opportunity to measure for these sites what's presence absence and what's there, and potentially in the future be able to get to populations as well and do it more effectively where the site may be extremely difficult to traverse, and transects across habitat types could be missing a lot. And so you might want a more broader net to capture what's there and what's not. When we look at metrics for dynamic alluvial valleys, we see a lot of things that have been proposed, a lot of things that are being talked about or tried for projects, not necessarily in performance standards yet, but to measure deposition, to measure retention and carbon, and to measure that sometimes directly in the sediments, in the morphology, or in the biological communities that are there that are unable to survive in high flow environments. So we lay this out at a somewhat high level, and we're trying to produce it. We're producing a document that will kind of give you that laundry list of things to consider and opportunities of different ways to assess the different metrics you see. Examples for floodplain diversity and how to measure that, looking at patches, and also then those in-channel habitat diversities. And you want to see that diversity of habitats to support growth in the species, and growth in the quality and the quantity of habitat across a site. Beaver colonization is a problem for many areas. It's addressed different ways in different areas. And so we are looking at ways to assess when is it a problem and when is it okay. Because I think it's important to consider that if you're removing beaver during a performance period, are you going to remove it long term? And if there's a risk to the site for having beaver there, long-term sustainability of the site matters for us. And so we want to make sure that are we assessing what's affecting the long-term sustainability, not just the short-term performance period. And so how do we assess what's quality in terms of beaver systems? Get into the differences. Most of our IBIs for macroinvertebrates and fish, most of our assessment methods are not developed for beaver systems. They don't target those, they target other habitats. And so we're trying to find what's out there and what could be used. So we have some metrics proposed for what you could do if beaver come into a site to still show that it's a high performing site, to still measure what you would need to show about the functional production of that site, even if it is an alternative outcome and an alternative set of performance standards and monitoring you may apply. So we have a bunch of examples there. I don't want to take up any more time here. If you have questions, if you want to talk about this, we are very interested. We're also running a workshop at the beginning of the National Stream Restoration Conference this August in Baltimore to dive into this and get folks' feedback. So we want to hear your comments. We're pulling the information from your experiences to fill out this document and make sure everybody has access to what are the ideas, what are the opportunities, and hopefully from there, in the future, not this document, but in the future, we'll be able to get to what are the recommended practices, what are the best practices. Right now, we're just trying to document everything that's out there and all the opportunities and how, so we can start trying them and using them and hopefully encourage more of these systems to come through as mitigation projects in addition to just being voluntary restoration projects. Because we have seen in the literature how productive and valuable these systems can be. So we want to encourage them and see them come through in mitigation as well. Thank you.
All right, so the Maryland Stream Framework is a process that we developed in the Baltimore district to capture credit and debit changes with mitigation projects. This is different than some of the SQTs you heard about earlier in the week in that we already had an existing crediting methodology that was in Baltimore district, and we were able to start building out like a crediting framework. So the presentation will be a little bit different. Just a clicker here, I guess. The big green one? That one. There we go. All right, so I'm not going to have time to run you through the entire process that we created today. There will be some instructional webinars and things I'll create later on. I'll just talk about some select topics where we did some things differently that if you're a district that's producing your own crediting methodology, you might be able to use some ideas we had if you wanted to, or even plug an existing assessment into our framework and make some adjustments. But these are some of the more interesting pieces of it that are different. One of them is we dealt with stream size by using the bankfull regional curves. We incentivize or encourage strategic site selection. And then we have an interesting way of working through multi-threaded channels and then dealing with stream buffers in a different way that accounts for like interspersing other credit types. Some acknowledgements for this. I've led this initiative, but I always considered myself more of a bus driver. We've had a ton of ideas and different stops along the way from different agencies, and a ton of feedback as we've used this in draft form since about 2020, about to roll out the main version here in the next month. We've had a ton of feedback from the banking industry as well, where they've been able to use the draft forms on mitigation sites that got approved and gave us ideas on what needed to change. Some of our objectives included to, we want to achieve no net loss. We're trying to encourage strategic site selection and thoughtful designs that, support the conservation of all our species in Maryland. We wanted to provide that procedural stability for the banking industry and for permit applicants, and then try to apply some data and some things y'all were already doing. This is the summary sheet for the framework. What this does is it draws together a bunch of different sheets, not too many. There's a different calculation sheet, for impacts, one for stream mitigation in channels. We did buffers separately because that allowed us to better do the credit interspersion. We have a fish passage tool as well, which will be released shortly. And it just tallies everything and tells you what your balance is. In this instance, this would be like a PRM versus a bank, but if a bank was using it, you just wouldn't have the impacts in there, obviously. So I'll first talk just about the stream mitigation calculator for the stream channels. So there's, this is, impacts versus the stream mitigation calculator, but we're using most of the same pieces on both sides of the equation for calculating impacts and calculating mitigation. There's a few different ones, but I don't need to go into real detail on that. This is a snapshot of some examples in the stream mitigation calculator for channels. And this, everything between the black, there we go, between that black and that black, that's one reach, and then this is a reach. Okay, so top and bottom of each of those are existing versus proposed, and you're running through, multiple different items. Most of them are pretty typical, stream length, your physiographic region, things like that, your stream quality, which is based on an existing assessment. I'm going to talk more about these guys that kind of stand out here. Channel thread, which helps us to encourage more multi-thread designs in dynamic alluvial valleys. I have a drainage area multiplier, which I used specifically to account for stream size, because what we saw across the east sometimes is, there was too much incentive for the bankers to go find the smallest channel sometimes, because that was, the least cost to produce the most credits. Well, we were losing out on like some area and things, considerations for the larger streams, and then site sensitivity, which is essentially site selection. So our unit of measure here is a functional foot, and we had to define what that baseline was. So 1 functional foot is equivalent to like 1 linear foot at a 1 square mile drainage area, and that's a perfect quality. And that's just our benchmark of what we're measuring everything else off of. And then there's some adjustments and things we add on to it for some other items. So we scaled everything to the bankful regional curves by region, so it changes if you're in the coastal plain or Piedmont or whatnot. And it basically, we wanted to get at, this is basically a functional square foot. We don't call that, we call it a functional foot. We went with the projected approach instead of using direct measurements of area, because we didn't want to get into the competition of who could build the wider stream and some really odd regulatory questions and processes, as you can imagine. We capped it at 10 square mile drainage area for our purposes of the calculator after some conversations with the agencies to make sure that we were sticking to kind of headwater and small wadable streams. So then we go on to channel thread. So this is how we account for the different multi-threaded channels and things. I added a figure here from the recent ordinary high watermark paper that came out of Erdick and Krell. And it's important to note here that this is only for like multi-threaded channels, which anastomosing, et cetera, which I define as those where you actually have soil development in between your channels and vegetative development. This isn't like braided channels where it's a stream responding to like just a really high bed load. And so we sat around a table, figured out how much we thought was appropriate to award. This wasn't one you can come up with a number scientifically. And so the agencies and I, we thought, an add-on of like about 20% for a second channel, 10% for a third. It's not a huge incentive, but it's enough to hopefully pay for the work if they want to build that extra habitat. Then next, I'll talk about this piece for a bit. This is the site selection piece. This is site sensitivity, and we had a lot of luck working with Maryland Watershed Resources Registry, and we identified where some of our more sensitive areas were in the state, much like our green print, green infrastructure does, I think. But so we had three different main factors here. It was catchments with less than 10% impervious, because we know that we start to lose species as we get into those higher impervious watersheds for various reasons. Our tier 2 and target ecological watersheds, and then within 1 mile of protected lands. So if you met all three of those, you'd be in the dark red areas on that map there, and that's kind of pulling the folks looking for sites into those areas to start. That's the place to start knocking on doors. Sure, a lot of people might not want to work with you. You might have to go out into some of the less dark areas where there's less incentive, but at least we're thinking through it in that way and beginning with the places that are most prioritized first, I hope. And part of the reason we do all this is getting back to foundational ecology. I think we've talked about this a bit at this conference, is colonization. You don't want to be building something out where nothing can ever get to it. We did all this work, we did all this review. We want to make sure that the project's going to be used by species, et cetera. So, the closer you are to the mainland source, the better off you're going to be in terms of that. So the crediting process works like this bump on, it's like a 30%, up to 30%, but it includes that map we just looked at, but also there is a site evaluation report, which we look at some things on the site a little closer, like, I'll get at some of those in a second here. On to the next one. So we go through a few different levels there. We have, broad landscape scale, site scale, and reach scale is the way we're looking at this. And so at the broad landscape scale, again, we're getting back to that map. We're looking at those different layers, the 1, 2, or 3, based on the items I mentioned before. Then when we get down to the site scale, we're seeing, is this a good site suitable for restoration? Is it a pretty clean site property-wise, or are you like lousy with utility easements where you're going to have no control over your vertical elevations or the changes in that because you're dodging all kinds of sanitary lines, et cetera? We look at valley confinements and some different other items there you can see on the slide. Is the title clear? And then we get into the reach scale, where we're looking more at the differences, of course, in stream quality, buffer quality, and all that. So this next piece is the buffer calculator. So this set's different from the stream one, obviously, and it's using some of the same factors but more applied to buffers. The important thing here is instead of doing a distance from the stream, we used area. So everything here is area based. It's acres and then quality, and then we also apply some of the other factors there. This is kind of how we envision. Either it looks funny from this angle or that slide turned. I'm not really sure what it is, but so we applied this concept here, and we create these credited stream buffer areas. So when you're going on in your site in the beginning, it's wherever your vegetation is pretty consistent. So like if you have a just straw pasture or whatever, that would be one area, or existing bottomwood forest, that'd be another area. And you're looking at the delta between those, existing quality versus proposed. In Maryland, it's really important that we're capturing, if somebody goes and cuts a mature forest, you might be losing credits on that end, and that's something the public weighed in pretty heavily on, that they were concerned about tree clearing on mitigation projects. What this does, though, in looking at using this in a area base, is like you can kind of work in your wetlands more easily than dealing with and other credit types. This is kind of what that sheet looks like. It kicks out a credit also in functional feet, so these are still stream credits, and we just had to come up with a number what we thought each acre was worth about, and it converts it to quality acres and then functional feet. You'll notice here too, I didn't really talk about this today because of time, but we do add additional crediting for the types of site protection you have. So the better site protection, existing versus proposed, the more credits that you ultimately get. So it's a small incentive to have stronger protection. For example, deed restrictions are very poor forms of site protection that can easily be overturned. Easements are a lot stronger, or buying the property outright's even better. So we do add those incentives as well. Some future steps we have is we've got to get this on public notice officially. We've been using it informally for a couple years now. It's ready for prime time. We've got to roll out our fish passage tool. Once this is done, it's pretty much completed. We just need to finish some calibrations. That'll be sometime this year, hopefully in the summer. We are working on a stream assessment that's based on the function-based rapid stream assessment. It's kind of like a merge between an SQT and RBP. It's pretty fast. And then we have a wetland tool that's coming out from the state. There's something important, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but one of the purposes of creating the tool, or one of our objectives, was to create a tool that other districts could adapt to. Troy mentioned earlier, the problem of a banker and trying to learn all these different crediting methodologies across states. Something we had in mind when we created this was creating a basic framework that other folks can plug. You can use your existing state credit assessment methods in here. So that was part of the purpose when we started. So, thank you.
All right, wow. Kind of a powerhouse covering the board on this thing. I know I got a lot of questions and some that I want to ask, and experiences that we all probably have on project sites that have a long history that maybe turned out, which never happens, of course, turned out differently in the end than what you designed at the beginning of it. Sometimes that happens, and how do you adjust for that, and what's sort of in bounds and out of bounds? And I think we're at the ready for some questions over here. With the microphone, if anyone have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand, and we got a mic at the ready. Don't be shy. Up here.
This is a question. Is this on? Okay, no. This is a question for Brian. That dynamic alluvial valley report is really interesting to me because we've had a lot of conversations about beaver here at this conference. Does that report consider soil integrity or changes to soil dynamics at all?
We do look at some of the potential monitoring approaches you could use for beaver systems that include soil integrity, and there's also aspects of fish passage and water quality changes as well, above and below, that we recommend as ways to assess whether your beaver habitat is detrimental to what you're trying to protect at that site and trying to restore there or not. So.
This question's for Nick, related to the crediting for anastomose channels. The secondary and tertiary percentage that are signed, is that based on each individual linear foot, or is it a combination of essentially the valley length?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's the length of it that runs along the main stem. So you get credit for the primary channel, your main channel, and then it's just a little bit of an add-on for those second and third. That's to encourage some of the cool habitat we have in those extra channels. You see all kinds of neat fish species and other things that don't live in the main stream.
Okay, so it doesn't necessarily incentivize to design a channel in parallel for the same length, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Oh, it would be, yeah, and it's, again, a small bump, but this would be, parallel channels. So if you had two or three channels running down valley, they'd have to be of a certain size, of course, like small perennial is kind of where we cut it off, but yep.
Okay, and that's assuming that there's valid reference or empirical data to support 2 or 3 flow paths through that valley.
Right, yeah, we'd have to have confidence that it can be pulled off at the site.
Okay, great, thank you.
Good morning, Nick. It looks like an awesome tool, and I appreciate the thought about transferring it to different regions. I was curious in the application on the impact side, what size of impacts, what kinds of impacts you have and are envisioning to use it for. If you could give us a few examples to explain the range. Thank you.
Sure, yeah, I appreciate the question. So on the impact side, I didn't go much into that in the time we had, but So we actually use two different, I'm trying to think how to best answer the question. Well, we use two different assessments on the impact side. One is super rapid. It's the old EPA RVP form, and that's for those really small impacts. We'll have a lot of like highway widening jobs kind of in Maryland where it doesn't make sense to do a full assessment. So like a smaller version of it for like that 70 feet on like 1,000 different streams going up down I-95 or something. I'm trying to think how to answer the other part of it. So the threshold for the Baltimore district isn't hard set. It's kind of case by case, and it depends on the quality of the resource being impacted as well. It would be used mainly for larger impacts that we see is where we require mitigation for the core, though there's a lot of really small stuff that is considered minimal and is not mitigated for. Hope I answered the question okay. Okay.
Well, we got sort of an observation that some of my projects that I run into that are, maybe have 4 or 5 years down the road, and it's a stream project, looks great, and all of a sudden the beavers show up, right? And it's fine at first, everyone's like, okay, and they're cutting down my trees that I planted in the riparian zone. As we get around and, at an IRT visit, what happens is we all stare at it, and it's like just thriving with life, right? I mean, you got herps everywhere, there's fish there. Yeah, there's some trees that are cut down, but it's stable everywhere. And I remember like, 10, 15 years ago, the first thing common was someone was like, trap them all out of here, get them out, bust this through, let's get the stream back to where it is. Now, all of us are struggling with this, what to do, right? Because on one hand, it's a stream to offset an impact in a stream somewhere, right? Well, it's kind of no longer a stream right there. I mean, it's a dynamic system, but is it offsetting the impact that you just mitigated for? And how do you crack that nut? Again, kind of a statement mixed in with a question a little bit. And I'm sure you've considered that in some of the conversations you've had. Wondering if you maybe can expand on that or give guidance or.
Definitely not going to give guidance, but yeah, we've definitely run into that, and that is, we're starting at the tools, how would you monitor, how would you assess, what's the framework for alternative endpoints? There is definitely the next question of, okay, what does this do to crediting? And crediting protocols are developed locally,
right.
and they're developed not just locally with the expertise, but locally based on IBIs and research and history of monitoring programs that vary state to state, and so you might have IBIs for this resource in this state, but not next door. And so the crediting aspect is going to be a very local question to resolve, but I think we also need more research to look into the classification question. Going to what Bill said is, what was here before, and stream resources, how frequently were these beaver systems in your area before? And if that's before 50 years ago or before 300 years ago, so is it still a stream resource, and have to deal with that question of what are the functions you're replacing? What are the impact sites and what are the functions lost? And are they still being provided at this beaver system? That beaver are often not a permanent feature. It's a come and go and come back over long time horizons. And so I think there's a lot of questions to wrestle with that,
Right.
that are more than just the crediting and more that keep or leave, but the classification and what are the functions there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the process will never work right if you're trying to be too specific on the functions lost at the impact site versus the mitigation site. You really need to look at the watershed approach. You might be providing different functions, but to the benefit of the watershed. And it might be things that we think existed more commonly in the past versus something that might have been pretty crummy that was impacted.
I was just going to add, from a stream evolution standpoint, there are stream evolution models that start with that anastomosed channel. And so they recognize that not all streams are single-threaded channels. So from a from a common sense standpoint, okay, if it's part of the stream continuum, it should be counted as a stream. I mean, that doesn't really go to the accounting and crediting and all that other kind of stuff. That's why I kind of suspend that stuff. But conceptually, it sort of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're all streams. Beaver is an ecological agent. I mean, it's kind of weird that, and this is my philosophy now. I'm deviating from agency policy and getting into personal philosophy. And if you don't like it, I'll retire tomorrow. But it's all part of a system.
Yeah.
And so to say we have to change it because it's changed in the time frame that we're monitoring it may be a little short-sighted. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. It's a conundrum, though. I know we're all trying, and this is great, because we're talking about it, right? Like, what's going to happen next? I'm thinking I'm not the only one in the room that has had this discussion on a project site somewhere of, hey, it looks great. It's different. It's not what we planned to begin with. Well, should I get rid of it? No, I don't know. Propose something. You know, you should propose something, Troy. I'm like, well, what do you want me to propose? And it puts us in a box. And the sense, at least in my projects, is that nobody wants to remove that resource. If it's changed, if I'm using beavers because it's the easiest thing to talk about, no one seems to want to change that, and everyone agrees, it seems, that is still part of the resource, and the resource is stable. In fact, it's adding to the resource. But it's a different type of resource, and how do you get through, the regulatory part of it, pointing to you at the end of the table here, the regulatory side of it. It sounds like we don't know the answer, but we're starting the conversation, which is exactly what we need to start doing, right?
And I think one improvement we've seen over the years, we're seeing more projects built with low bank designs that can handle, and some additional buried grade control here and there that can handle, beaver dams going in. The stream might move from one side of the valley to another, but it doesn't down cut, and that's okay. Versus we were having a lot more problems with the beaver dams and just the strictly bankful designs that didn't consider the larger floodplain, I think, in the past. And so now that we've turned that corner, I think, as an industry, even if we're building a bankful channel, we're still looking at the larger floodplain in a different way. I think we're in better shape to handle those moving forward.
Yeah, I'm in no way advocating a stream that had problems to begin with, and then that happened, and then say, well, the beavers are here, That's not what I'm getting at. Not what I'm getting at all.
Yeah, hi, this is Mike Moxley, Corps of Engineers. I do a lot of stream mitigation projects, and I know that one of the big issues when we do mitigation projects is having consistent, predictable conversations with the people doing the work. And they're always wondering, boy, we're going to meet with the agencies. Oh gosh, what are they going to ask me? And they're always paranoid about meeting with us and how we're going to evaluate their stream projects. And so, Bill, I think, kudos on the 6 big questions. I mean, it's just adding predictability to our interaction with the public when we're evaluating their projects. They know what we're going to talk about. They know what we're going to ask them about. And my question is, how much was that document vetted with the public when you were putting it together?
Oh, the approach?
Yeah.
Not much. No, it's kind of an organic document. At least that's the term I use, in that we developed it, as I said, for Region 4 staff. If it has legs and seems to be robust, and Brian has a paper copy here. It's draft version 1, so it's our first cut. As it goes out, it may change, but the short answer to your question is no.
Well, I'll add to that just a hair a bit, because you did start with a workshop with academics and folks discussing it and review, and you've had review by a lot of different folks inside and outside the agency, but it hasn't been out on a public notice or for like a public comment process.
Yeah, I was thinking you were talking about like public notices and stuff like that. And we did have some providers providing into it. So a little bit, yeah. Okay, I'll take that back. Yes, yes, we did.
Nick, so where did you come up with the multi-channel? Did people propose that? Is that how it started? And what do you do about buffers?
Oh, okay. Good
I've got
question.
one more.
That's a good question because that's a tricky one. Yeah, so you can count. So the multi-thread came from, it was generally something that some folks in the industry wanted, not everybody. And so we set it in a way that, you know, it was a little bit of credit. We wanted to be able to pay for the work of those extra channels. Back when I used to be a grad student, you know, was sampling all these fishes all over the Southeast, making a minimum wage, whatever. And I was pulling seines, and we were just noticing so many different fish in those secondary channels, and we're like, this is really important. It might not be on every site, but you know, so that's somehow how we got there. We just wanted to put enough credits out there to make the work possible. And then the other question about buffers, yeah, that is hard. So because we're using area-based instead of distance from the stream, it allows you to potentially, if those happen to be really wide apart, you can also count that strip in between the channels if you wanted to as part of your buffer. I don't know if you'd want to or not, if you just want to call that area dynamic and look outside of there. We got away from the required buffers for credits idea. There is a required buffer that has to be at least 35 feet, but that could be anything. It could be another channel, it could be a wetland, it could be another crediting program even, or the Daniel Boone National Forest or whatever's nearby, you know. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, and the other one, I saw you doing a fish passage beta version, public notice. What is that?
Yeah, so we developed with some agency partners. We had NOAA and DNR and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So that adapts, it's like a build off of the stream calculator that we have pretty much completed, but we were waiting till this first piece was finished so we can calibrate accurately to it as well as we could. And because between all the permit applications, you know, you can only do one thing at a time, programmatic, right? So.
What is that going to be like for credits?
It's for credits, yeah, and we started out only for big dams, not that we really want to do culverts, but that was really hard nut to crack, so we're like, okay, let's just focus on the big dams, and we were really lucky, this is important, that we had this, Nature Conservancy and agencies, they created this prioritization for us, so that was a big piece where, you know, we add, you know, it's more credits for the prioritized dam that the agencies say, these are the ones that are really plugging up our fishes in the Chesapeake region. It's awesome. There is something that's rolling out nationwide over the next couple of years that American Rivers and some others are involved with. So hopefully other folks will have the same abilities and have those prioritized for them. Because I know it's hard to figure out as a regular, you know, which one's the more important dam to take out in the watershed, right? It's really hard to know that. But with the resource agencies doing that piece of the work for you, it makes it a lot easier. So.
I have one more follow-up question for you, Nick. We've heard throughout the conference the theme of cumulative effects and small impacts being nickeled and dimed to death. So I heard that usually a lot of small impacts are not considered, are not mitigated for. It looks like now you have a tool that might allow that. I don't know what your landscape looks like. I come from the West Coast region, but where I come from, there are a lot of areas where the sum of the small impacts is very relevant. So having a tool might allow to change that practice of and now include a request for mitigation for those small areas in an efficient, easy way for permitting, and with that increase the opportunities for banking and restoration.
That's a really good question, and it really gets at the way that the different core districts operate in terms of like when they require mitigation for impacts. And that really, it's a balance between, you know, what the resource agencies and environmental type folks that, you know, want to see most of the impacts mitigated like ourselves, but then the public too that we're regulating and what is possible there. Because, you know, some of these really small impacts, if you drag like a family trying to build a garage through the whole mitigation process, that's not gonna work, right? So, you know, it's at a certain threshold once you have a larger development, a roadway, and that's just how it is. It's above my decision level, just how we operate. So.
biological component to it? When you do your assessments, is there a biological component to it? And if so, who is doing that part of it?
Right, so we did add a biological component. There's two pieces. First one doesn't plug into the framework at all, but we do ask that they do basically IBI kind of stuff. You guys are familiar with that. But that doesn't plug into the framework. That's just for informational. What we do use in the framework is in the stream assessment itself, there is a really rapid method for fish and macros. And the idea is that the folks out there assessing, they might not be experts on every, like identifying every Natropus little minnow species or every little different type of, but they should become familiar because they might be people that are more into measuring stream, bankful, all that. And so we get at more taxonomic level the more like order family level, and they're just identifying, they're saying, yeah, we have, caddisflies, stoneflies, mayflies, there's a lot of them. After, okay, you're doing pretty good. No, we just have chironomids, bad, so it's, kind of on a sliding scale there. I know it's simple, but when you think about the biology, and it has to be rigorous enough that you're doing something meaningful, but simple enough that you can train all the regulators on how to do it, who have to be familiar with, by the way, tidal processes, wetland processes, stream processes, and a ton of federal regulations. You probably aren't going to be able to train them up all on like, the smallest detail of the different genuses and things. So.
I got one more question. This is the big question, right? This is like the elephant in the room question. So is there a perfect methodology that we're going to strive for here, or is this a continuing evolution of assessment of what we're doing, given the resources that we're fixing, and the geologic layout of the country and so on like that? Will we ever arrive, or is it always an evolutionary type of discussion with regulatory components to it? Foundational with the questions, I think, which those might stay constant for a very long time. Big question, right? And it's all on the top of my life. Is there going to be a perfect? In certain regions, is there ever going to be one? It's an open question, a totally unfair question. Just so you know, I want to make sure you know that. Curious for all three of you, Bill. I'm not sure if you just kind of go down the list and maybe opine here as a closing sort of statement here.
Once again, the short answer to your question is no. In fact, after a long time of working on HGM, working on rapid assessments and things, I think the nature of the regulatory work that we do and the functional assessments, you'll never, at the very basis, we don't measure function, right? That's kind of a misnomer. Tell anybody. And therefore, it's difficult to say, is there a perfect functional assessment? We measure indicators and things. And actually, the whole point behind the approach was after all this time of watching all these rapid assessments and working on HGM, which is considered still a fairly technical, detailed, complex assessment. Did we hit it? I don't know. Probably not. And so the whole point behind the approach was to say, look, there are just basic questions and basic information that perhaps we should get to, no matter how you get there. Use Nick's functional assessment, use our functional assessment, whatever it is, but get to that basic question. Even with those functional assessments, you'll need probably site-specific data, particularly for monitoring. And therefore, it's really the information that's important to fill in those conceptual ideas of what's a stream, how does it tick, what's a wetland, how does it tick. And certainly functional assessments can fit in to the greater conversation, but I don't think alone they're enough. Brian?
Yeah, no. We've seen the evolution in this program over the last 20 years of how we've assessed streams. and stream mitigation protocols, and we'll continue to see that. We're seeing it in the monitoring assessment world of, you know, how do we assess these things? Oh, wait, we can now do, well, EPA can't, but consultants can do drone-based assessments and really high-quality imagery, and you can do imagery that's starting to see through water and starting to assess flow from imagery. And, you know, our tools are changing. eDNA is a whole new world potentially for how we assess what's there and populations. Our tools are changing, our resolution is changing, our understanding of the species dynamics and the functions occurring is growing, and so we're always kind of chasing a little bit a better understanding and an understanding of what is most important and what are the key stressors or what are the key limiting factors, however you want to approach it, so that we are assessing effectively, because we're almost never directly assessing the functions. We're doing proxies and we're trying to fine-tune that process. So, but we're getting better, and the key point is documenting what we're doing, laying out our approaches and thoroughly working through it, and then using it, learning from it, and, you know, in 5-10 years, seeing what we learned and refining. So.
Right, no, I'd agree with that. You know, there's, yeah, definitely no perfect assessment or functional assessment, but I'm a person who believes there's no, you know, there's no such thing as perfection. You know, it's just an idea that you are always like looking for, right? I think one of the most important things, though, in creating an actual functional assessment for like assessing stream or wetland is, or stream specifically, is that it's agnostic to design approach. So you want something, because you can't create just like a pile of assessments in a district. You can't train everybody on how to do that. And plus the public, the Troys of the world that work in multiple districts will be very mad at us if we do that. So you have to make it so that it's, you know, it kind of covers all the design types and you have all your bases covered. So I think that's what a lot of folks are working on. I'll just leave it there.
I would echo that absolutely. You know, agnostic of design approach is super important, because there's going to be new design approaches. There's going to be new tools to help aid design, and we want to make sure we're focused on the outcomes. You know, what's coming out the other end for the resource, not how they got there. So the more we can focus on is what came out the other end, what we want to see, a high quality resource, a self-sustaining into the future resource, the better we can be.
Yeah, this is awesome. I mean, really, this is a great discussion that we're having of, there's not a perfection anywhere. We all want to get, you know, our resources from a degraded state to an improved state. How do we get there? Not sure. Here's a couple things that we're doing. Are they working, sort of? Are they working really well? Sometimes, you know. When we're at the end, was it what we thought it was going to be at the beginning? Lots of times, sort of not. But is it functioning? And that's kind of what I'm here, like, is it functioning when we get there? And then how do we measure it from a regulatory standpoint, at least from a sponsor standpoint? This has been a great discussion. Is there any other questions here? I had a great time, guys. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you.